Add to stream. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the stream tonight for the talk on research through callsigns through history, including the research I came across for GM6NX. It's nice to see all the comments on there. Just before we start, we'll do a couple things. So, as well as obviously me doing the talk tonight, if anybody else out there doesn't necessarily even have to be a club member necessarily, who's a local ham who wants to do a talk at all through the GM6NX stream, then you're more than welcome to. Either anybody, the club member, can obviously contact me and Jonathan via the Google groups, and anybody outside of the club could email the club secretary, and we'll hopefully sort something out to enable you to do the talk. It doesn't have to necessarily be radio related, just something that's a nice, interesting topic that will be a good talk for everybody. So thank you for everybody who is here. It's much appreciated. And obviously, being the first time, there may be a couple of hiccups here and there, but we'll try and get through it as best as I can, without any hiccups, possibly, as much as I can. Right, so let's do this. So this talk is research through callsigns and history. So first of all, introduction of why. So the reason I think that it's a good idea to do this sort of thing is that, as well as callsigns, history is an important thing for people to remember. As you can see recently, you know, things like your history and stuff like that, you learn lessons through it, not necessarily in the callsign history particularly, but, you know, where we've come from in radio. And what we deem easy now wasn't necessarily easy years ago. And you'll see through this a bit of change with callsigns and why they change for particular reasons. And that'll help with some understanding of, you know, where we are today and how easy amateur radio, as some communication and amateur radio is today, and how hard it was back then. And it gives an interesting perspective, to say the least. So, where to start with research? This can be an interesting one. Obviously, these days in 2020, the most research is started on the internet. It's got to be. It's the mass information space these days. And also, for the fact of the matter is, we're all in lockdown at the minute, and I can't go to a library. I can't go to, you know, somewhere else to look up something. So unfortunately, internet is the way to go. It does have its own challenges, though. As I've stated there, you know, the current call sign of the club, when you do a Google search, because the club website is most active, comes at the top of the search. Now, that creates its own challenges, because you can say, I'm searching for GM6NX and trying to find some past call sign information. It could be 2-3 pages back in Google, or it might not even be there because it's not necessarily quite the correct research term. And that can create its own challenges. But as well, so for amateurs, you know, there's other places we can find the information. Ofcom, that has its own challenges because Ofcom haven't been... And the people have looked after the licensing for the UK for, you know, all time. It has changed from different organizations over the years, so they don't necessarily carry all the records you want. And secondly, as well, if you're researching this on behalf of someone, Ofcom don't tend to like to reveal information due to the fact of data protection these days. The RSGB is a good place to go as well. Great, they do have archives. Unfortunately, a lot of the archive information isn't available on the internet publicly for easy access. Because like your recent Radcom, you know, magazines are, if you remember the RSGB, but other older information about call signs and different things like that, unfortunately, is not available. Subsequently, you can put an email into the RSGB's historian section. Unfortunately, due to the current situation, I have sent an email into the RSGB, but unfortunately haven't received anything back as of yet. That's because obviously they're highly busy with all the remote invigilation testing they're doing at the moment. So you will have to bide your time with some places trying to get information because, you know, they're busy doing other things as well, and especially when you can't see them in person either. Other good places are magazines. Magazines are great because pretty much since time memorial, when actual amateur radio started, there's been some form of magazine coming through in some form of manner. And that means that there's a record of not necessarily just the call signs and the names of people, but also stuff like, what's happened in a district, or, what's the current problem, or what's the current DX. And this becomes a key thing to search for, because it gives you more information than just a name, address, call sign. And it gives you more of a story of what's going on at the time. Also, a good thing is call books. Call books are great, but they don't hold tons of information, and they're not always available, especially when they have names and addresses things. A lot of them are sometimes covered by data protection. And if you don't obviously want to buy every single version going back, then it doesn't necessarily always help. Some of them are trackable down, but it's not as easy, just due to the fact of some people just keep them off record for data protection, and are not readily available necessarily on the internet. Call signs. So call signs have changed a lot throughout the years, especially when you're going as far back as we're going tonight, which is like the 20s. And through that, you've got to look at what search terms you used. So, for example, in 1937, it was GM6NX, and obviously up to current times it is. But if we go right back to 1926, it's 6NX. And this is because over time, the QSO started just in the UK area and then spread further. And as they've spread further, they've obviously needed a country code, because they're now starting to talk to foreign stations that may have a 6NX equivalent, for example. So over time, the call sign has changed. So knowing the right search terms and where to search gives you a better chance necessarily of finding some more information. So most recent history, obviously, the club, we know, where we started in 1979. And obviously, soon after, the club acquired the call GM6NX. So the next few slides are going to go back from that, from the start of where the club was all the back down to 1920s, and give more of an overview of what research I've found, because I want to not make this talk 10 hours long. So it would just be a short overview of all the different things that I've found, and what we can do. Right. So in the 1960s, some of the audience may remember this, but I will not name names. But in the first picture, we have Doogie Howard in the Scottish VHF convention in Perth, 1965. He's the one on the left with the nice smart glasses and the bow tie. And that gave me a bit of a clue. He was definitely into his science, to say the least, and the way he was dressed for the VHF convention. And it's the only picture we have of a person who has previously held the call that isn't the club that I did find. And this is courteous of the Lothian Radio Society, who had it in their archives that I managed to come across when I was doing numerous searches for little bits. So if we go back further to the 1950s, I can still trace the station at this point. It does get a bit harder at this point, just because the information isn't necessarily there. Just because it's more just the call books and generic information, and not anything like we have these days, like events going on at the club and we put it on the club website and things like that, for example. So in this one, they're in a 1951 call book, and also in a 1949 shortwave listener article in America, and a third American call book in 1946. I also found out some more detail, a bit of his address as well, which was 22 Waverley Crescent, Stirling. And obviously at this point, this is just after the war. And obviously, if we go back further, the war is coming. And it gave me the inkling that, something, he may have been involved in something in the war. So as part of that, I did start doing the research relevant to the war as well. So now we've got to the war. So as soon as I did some research, I came across obviously the radio security service, because everybody knows via the films and other things now about Bletchley Park. However, I did a bit more deeper research and obviously came across the radio security service, because one station at Bletchley Park couldn't come up with all the information that they needed at Bletchley Park to do the decoding. And as part of this, I found out that from Bruce, who confirmed to me via email that he was as part of one of the listeners as part of the war, and ultimately, reduced the war by giving the information to Bletchley Park, who eventually decoded it to ultimately win the war. However, the most interesting part was I came across obviously the system and the regional different I'll call them stations, for example, but regional headquarters of where all this information was collected, because obviously for secrecy reasons, you couldn't just say to them, go and communicate with this one central hub. They wanted to split it a bit apart so that obviously secrecy was kept as much as possible. The interesting part was, though, the regional station for Scotland was actually in Stirling itself, in 67 Port Street, which under Captain Wallace, which still exists today. It is a hairdresser's these days. However, I would like to, and I will come back to at the end of the talk, but I would like to actually look into doing a blue plaque for the actual building, due to the fact of what that regional headquarters did for the war. And I think something that's radio, that's well recognizable within Stirling, would be a good tribute to the people who were involved in that building, but also the entirety of Scotland and what they served to help the war effort, in secret, obviously, until later in years when people found out more about Bletchley Park. However, not many people know about the general listeners outside of the radio community, and I think it would be a good thing for the radio community within Scotland to recognise it permanently. Before the war in 1930s, we pick up the call sign again. One of these is in a newspaper article, which is on the club's website. I haven't got it here per se. But more importantly, it gives us a bit more information about the call sign, and just gives us a general overview that it is active and it's, working people across the world. But where we start to get a lot more information, which I didn't expect, and did find out over time, was the RSGB had something called TR Bulletin, and this TR Bulletin was like the Radcom of its day, and it basically shows a link between the RSGB and the call sign. It doesn't show, however, much about where he lived and things like that. However, it does give an address of Forth Bank Cottage. As far as I'm aware from looking at maps through the years, and that doesn't tend to exist these days. But it was interesting just to show that it showed him moving around. It doesn't really tell us too much except where he was in the area of Stirling. So he moved more from where the football ground is these days in Stirling, and the rugby site and cricket area, more towards obviously Barrettburn over time. The interesting thing was, though, he was an RSGB district manager. And the other interesting thing is he was in District F of Scotland. Now, the RSGB these days obviously don't refer to the districts with letters, and it gave just a different perspective of how they've changed over years from renaming of different things. The early 30s and late 1920s, as part of this tracing the call sign, I wanted to see a proof of the call sign operation as many years as possible. Luckily for me, the QST magazine in America does a herd section, because obviously transatlantic communication in them days was very highly prized DX, and it means that I could help trace it, because if they heard someone from Europe, it was more likely to be in the magazine than anything else. This was all well and good, but the only thing is it did only provide the call sign, so it didn't prove who it was at the time and who was at the controls and things like that, unfortunately. However, it did give me, the call sign over time. So we've got 1936, 1931, 1930, and 1929. So we've traced it back as far as that. And then from there, it goes a bit quiet, unfortunately. So from 1929, I don't really see anything beyond that until we get through to the 1920s, where I have a bit more of a breakthrough, which turned out to produce a lot more questions, though. And one thing I haven't mentioned is obviously the form of research which can help is in what we're doing is QSL cards, because obviously it gives a lot of information. It gives who it is, what the station's working, what band they were on, and possible power and other things besides that. Personal information relevant to the radio equipment they were using at the time. And this clearly can actually help with having a key understanding of what they're working with at the time and what possible equipment they may have. Here's an example of the QST magazine. So there's the called heard section, and there's obviously a front of the QST magazine from the 1929. So it was basically finding a load of these and having a link that had a lot of QST magazines locally that enabled me to track it through time. So QSL cards, as I said, obviously the QSL cards made life a bit easier, and here's an example of two that I found. The interesting bit is the actual person who owns a call sign at the time has changed at this point, and J.D. McTay is in Glasgow now. So the call sign's moved from Stirling to Glasgow. Unfortunately, there's no history at the moment that tells me why it's moved across there, and I'm not 100% sure. The other interesting thing is obviously we've got G-6NX, which I expect, because at this point regional differences have not actually happened at this point. So generally everybody's just G and the 3 denoted afterwards, which is for us is 6NX. However, in 1927, I did find this QSL card that had G-6NX. And as far as I'm aware, looking at obviously the different regional letters for the call signs, obviously C isn't particularly used these days. However, it is used for Wales. Now, it doesn't specifically say on the QSL card he is in Wales. However, obviously from this, there's a possibility of he may have been working a station with his call sign while he was in Wales. Unfortunately, there's no proof to say that happened, but it is interesting that he has produced a QSL card with a bit of a different call sign, with a different regional indicator than what we're obviously used to these days. Now, the TR bulletin is very interesting. This gave me quite a bit of information, as well as the name change and the address. It reported on actual Scotland's District 1. So this was like the equivalent to the RSGB news these days. This was a District 1 section of the news in the TR bulletin. And the interesting thing, it told us about the person, and he's got about a couple of paragraphs. So he's clearly, quite important to the RSGB within the district at this point. And it also says, that he was one of the district representatives at this point as well, and helped out. The other interesting thing, it does show the DX at the time he worked. So he worked Italy, and he worked quite a lot of Europe, and a lot of parts of the UK as well. The interesting thing is as well, I also found the 2TT call sign. Now, I don't know if Stevie is in the actual broadcast tonight, but obviously he's now GM2 TT. Unfortunately, it doesn't say a name or who it was, unfortunately, but however, his call sign is mentioned, which I found very interesting when I did see this. And it also, he's being received quite well in Italy with the R7 there. So he's clearly getting out and doing pretty well for himself. So the conclusion of my talk is obviously we found some interesting things about the call sign moving from Stirling over to Glasgow, and we've also found out that some interesting things with the call sign have been done during the war, important things that to change the tide of history and was very important. And we've also not been able to find records for quite the year the change happened. So we go from 1927 to 1936. It's only 1936 that we get the name for the Hauer, Dougie Hauer. So there's not that changeover. So I'm not quite sure what year that happened. Hopefully with further research over time, I may be able to answer this question. But unfortunately, it isn't the case that obviously until I do that further research, I might be able to that question. But over time, with history, obviously some history is lost. And it means, there's something that, we may never answer the question fully of when the change or why it happened or anything like that. Lastly, I've got a couple of interesting things I want to conclude with. So the picture below is a person called Frank. Now, the interesting thing is I accidentally just came across this when I was doing research. Now, he is the 6NX station in America. At the time, he was referred to as 6NX. Now, this is an actual picture of Frank because on the website I found this is definitely the 6NX. And he's doing some Morse as well, which is quite nice. But what got a bit better, which I thought where I would never see, is in this here. Oh, why has that not worked? Oh, great. 2 seconds. Sorry about this. There we go. That's the one. So there's an actual video of Frank working Morse. Now, from the 1920s, I don't think there's many videos of someone working Morse. And also the amount of QSL cards he's got and how happy he is to have them. So I thought I'd show this as something unique that, we wouldn't very much see very much these days at all. And something that's of interest, even though it's technically not obviously our 6NX, it is 6NX in the 1920s. Right. 2 seconds. Where's that gone? F5. Oh, now you'll work. Right. There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. Any questions? If you want to put them in the YouTube comments or Facebook comments, I'll be able to see them and hopefully be able to answer any questions. If not, I would like to say, thank you for Jonathan helping me getting this organized and helping me to actually, perform the talk as well. It's actually run a bit short than I thought. Actually, I'm a bit quick, unfortunately. However, I do have more in depth and links and things like that. So if anybody would like to email me with any questions, or if you want any direct links to help with getting more information, because for example, the QST magazines, I have a link where you can find all the ones through history and years that can you can help you search for any call signs or history you want about amateur radio. There's also one with all the TR bulletins, all the way from 1925 all the way up to, I think, 31 when they were produced, and they were produced quarterly, I think, a year, and that would give you a bit more information as well. I'd also like to say that the next talk will be with Bob, MM0MMQ, on the design and creating with 3D printers. I don't know, at the same time as what we did tonight with 3D printers, and that sounds like a very interesting talk. Right, so let's see what questions we've got. Coupler is still there. Anybody know what local BLCs may have been? If anybody would, and I will change this up a little bit, if you want more information on anything RSS related, because I've seen there's a few questions there, and there's this book which I bought, which was a radio war, and it basically goes through what's in the radio security services, and this is where I got the information relevant to the where the regional offices were. And also in the back here, it does actually have an index of who was involved to the best of his knowledge. and the GM6NX call sign is in the back of this as well. So if anybody locally wants to borrow this, when everything goes back to normal, then you're more than welcome to ask me and I can send it through to you, or if you're in the club, I can pass it on, not a problem at all. And, you can have a look through this. But if anybody would like any research or anything like that of different elements that I've found, then you're more than welcome to, and I'll send you an email of different links and things that I've found over time. Other than that, I don't think there's much else for me to really say. There is one about the GM4 call. So I obviously have been told that the club did have a GM4 call in the 80s. I've mostly focused on the GM6 call that we have these days. And at some point, I would probably maybe do some more research into the GM4 call that we did have. Unfortunately, I came up with that much information that I put this talk together. But I'll certainly maybe later down the line, maybe do some research further into that and where that came from originally as well. But as of yet, I don't have any information for that, unfortunately, Ian. But thank you for your question. Lastly, I think that's about it, to be honest, for tonight. The 45 meters, that's it. So yeah, there was, it did say 45 meters. I think it's just they had different allocations at the time and they called it slightly different bands to what we have today, with them saying 45 meters. So obviously in them days, they probably could get away with a lot more than what they would necessarily these days. Because obviously there isn't the same rules and regulations as we have. And it's more experimental than anything. Because obviously you've got to think, back when they did the QSL cards, obviously that was only 6 or 7 years after obviously the amateur radio call signs were properly brought in. And at that point, obviously before then, all the licenses that were given out were just for experimentation purposes for science. So obviously it's probably the case that, they would do whatever bands they could get on to get the conversation done and to get the contacts. They probably would try and do the best that possibly they could. And that's maybe why obviously they were on the 45 meter band and not what we would currently class as the bands for amateur radio. Don't think there's many other questions. I know some of you are also typing in on YouTube to answer any questions that I haven't covered before I've got around to them. And I think that's about it. Yeah, so on the 7th, we've got Bob's talk with about 3D printing at 7:30. And hopefully we'll have maybe some more people viewing, and we'll get this down a bit better. I do apologize for obviously not having the presentation go quite right at the end, but hope you enjoyed the little video and the presentation. And thank you very much. And we'll all obviously see each other, hopefully, when everything gets back to normal. And we'll get back to the club being down and open. And obviously, for anybody who isn't a member of the club, when this is all over and the club is reopened, you're more than welcome to visit the club and to see, if you want to necessarily join the club, or if it's just for a visit to say hello and to have a look around. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your night.